What's up, theology nerds? This is Tripp. You're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. It is a podcast about theology.
Sometimes homebrewing.
And sometimes homebrewing. Not that often. It's more of a metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
But if the people ask for it,
then we can do that.
We can have a homebrewing podcast.
Yes.
You know what really good way you could end up trying a bunch of my homebrews?
What's that?
If there was an event this year that was super special where I brewed at a production brewery my award-winning beer recipes.
Maybe for like some sort of anniversary or something?
Yeah. But that's a secret, so we're not even going to talk about it right now.
We're not talking about that.
It's absolutely unrelated to theologybeercamp.com.
Yep.
And any event that could happen this summer. But you know what is happening in May?
I do.
May 7th, 8th?
Yep. Jesus is going to ride a dinosaur, right?
Jesus Rode a Dinosaur, Faithful Youth Ministry in the Scientific Age. It's an event in Minneapolis, Minnesota. You can go to sciencewham.org. I'm going to be there doing a live podcast the first night with my new friend, Science Mike. I think we're going to be battling it out. Oh. He doesn't know that we're battling it out yet, but I'm thinking if Tony Jones is arranging it, why would we not have a competition?
Yeah.
And now that Science Mike and I have talked for an hour on the phone, I feel like we're good enough friends to argue in public.
And if you weren't before, you definitely will be after.
Yeah, after it, we will be. Also, there's some like people that some people have heard of, like Christina Tippett coming.
Kristen Tippett.
Uh-huh.
I had brunch with her once.
Oh, yeah. Kenda
really nice.
Dean from the Center for Youth Ministry at Princeton is going to be there. Mark DeVries, Paul Douglas, Janet Ray, and Andy Root.
Hey.
Paul Wallace.
Paul Wallace, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, it's going to be awesome. It's only $99 to go to the event.
Wow, that's a great
And
deal.
it's
Jesus
about
riding a dinosaur for $99?
Well, I'm guessing that is more of what you could call a lure. And that it's mostly about youth ministry in a scientific age. But yeah, it's gonna be lots of fun, and I hope you come out. I do. And connected to it, the week before, I think it's the week before, but we're gonna do a whole little symposium, an online symposium on how you talk about science and how the awareness and engagement of science affects student ministry.
Yeah,
thing on the Homebrew blog. So
that sounds awesome. Speaking of which, if you're in North Carolina for March 2nd, Why God Loves Science.
Yeah, it's a Theology Nerd Boot Camp in Chapel Hill with Jeffrey C. Pugh.
Yeah,
author of the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to the End. He's also written a whole bunch of other books, but
it's clearly the one he's best known for.
But the one he's best known for. Not saying it's his bestseller yet. Yet.
Go buy 100 copies right now.
True story. Anyway, we're going to do a day-long workshop on religion and science, literacy. Not just like understanding it, but how to engage it, present it, and feel comfortable and competent as a leader. Discussing it in your congregation, discussion groups, pub groups, whatever.
So all-day boot camp and then a live podcast.
And then a live podcast.
March 2nd.
And at night, we're adding fiction onto the end.
Yep.
Why God Loves Science Fiction. So we can talk about
science fiction.
Star Wars.
Yeah.
Among other things, other science fiction like Battlestar Galactica.
Oh, yeah.
I love Battlestar. I hope they remake Battlestar. You know how much I love Battlestar Galactica? And if y'all haven't seen it, it's now added to Amazon Prime streaming.
I just started.
Oh, where are you?
It's so good. Well, I mean, the first episode's like 3 hours long.
Well, it's like a mini-series.
Yeah. So I've only seen like the first 3 episodes.
Oh, okay.
But that's like 5 hours of...
I know, but it's so good. It is so good.
It's really
so
good.
Starbuck was like the first character on a TV show that I was like, this is like this powerful hot woman who, like, her personality and character and how, like, everything about her is just like, this is amazing. Well, so you can tell you like TV shows when you'll rewatch things you've already watched. And she's on Instagram now.
Oh, nice.
And she, like, posts pictures of her and her dog.
Oh,
a lot.
That's cute.
And I'm just like, see, I start smiling when I see it. I'm like, oh, Starbuck. Yeah. And I can't tell you Well, I definitely don't want to tell you because you haven't even seen it yet about the ending in Starbuck and the role that she plays.
I don't want to know.
Oh, it's so good. So Battlestar is great. Well, there will have to be a spoiler warning probably at the podcast.
At podcast, definitely. Anything that involves a live podcast, just assume spoilers are going to be revealed.
Mm-hmm.
So, wait, who's on this podcast anyway? Who are we talking to today?
Andy Root.
Andrew Root. He wrote a book called Faith Formation in
a Secular Age.
Yes, yeah. He did.
So you may guess, if you listen to this podcast, that someone that wrote a book about youth ministry engaging the work of Charles Taylor, that this conversation actually ends up being a lot about Charles Taylor and the book Secular Age. Nathan, any ideas as to how that could have happened?
I'm trying, and off the top of my head, I have nothing. Wait, there's that one thing. That time that you made me and some other students read it in like a month.
That's true.
Yeah, I'm really actually. I'm glad I read the book. I had a lot of people tell me afterwards, like, "Oh my god, you read the whole thing?" Like, I got like 200 pages in and I stopped. So I'm really glad that
you just look at them and say, "Wuss."
I know. I got a 7-page single-spaced summary of the book.
An excellent 7-page single-spaced summary. That's why you should email Media Guru at homebrewchristianity.com.
Well, you won't have to read it.
And then you don't have to read like 700 pages.
Actually, it would probably be helpful for this interview.
Oh, it would. Like, I'm just saying, Charles Taylor wrote a book called The Secular Age. His also Sources of the Self. Both of them, big books, amazing works, tons of insight. Canadian philosopher. He's a Catholic philosopher. But he's not a Catholic who's believing still. He's a Catholic who's believing again.
Yes.
Coming back to faith in a new way. And it's an amazing text. It inspired Dr. Root to start reflecting on it, and then American youth ministry and stuff. I will just say it comes something in the interview, but in the book itself, the first of 3 books that are kind of going through this, he does, like Charles Taylor does in Secular Age, a genealogy of the Secular Age and Western experience and philosophy and the way science impacts it and the shifting nature of culture and religion's relationship to culture and the impact of different pluralisms and such. He gives a genealogy of American youth ministry and American religion and evangelicalism. And it comes up in the podcast. But I'll just say, if you are an actual youth minister and these concepts fit you, and you're like, oh, I want to think about that, the book has got tons of stuff we don't talk about in it at all. Just because I know most of you aren't youth ministers, and plenty of you aren't American. But if you are an American youth minister, then there's like not reading this book, so there's a poor life decision.
Right. It's really good. I really enjoyed the conversation. So,
anyway, you should definitely check it out. And before we go on the interview, I just want to tell you all, get ready
to
see us in a movie.
I thought you were going to say Rumble.
Oh.
Well, there's a little bit of that in the movie.
There is. Nathan and I are in a movie called The Road to Edmond. You can go to theroadtoedmond.com.
That's right.
And the screener's coming out soon. Not screener, the trailer.
Yes,
coming out soon.
Yes.
So if you go on there, you can sign up, and then we'll email you the trailer.
You'll know. You'll be the first person to know
once it comes out. It is a aggressive road trip buddy comedy. Aggressive, progressive, spiritual reflection on American religion in the plot shape of a buddy road trip comedy.
That's right. It's great.
Yeah, theroadtoedmond.com. And check out theologybeercamp.com because info's about to drop.
Stuff's going to happen.
For the Homebrewed Christianity Birthday Party Beer Camp Edition. No, it'd be Theology Beer Camp Birthday Edition.
There it is. Theology Beer Camp :
Birthday Edition. Yeah, 10th birthday. So if you've ever wanted to day drink for someone's 10th birthday,
now's your chance.
The podcast is turning 10. It's time to be that parent who wishes they weren't a parent and drinks throughout their kid's birthday party.
You can drink throughout your kid's birthday, and your kids don't even need to be there.
Yeah,
that's the best
called
part.
Theology Beer Camp Birthday Edition. And that can happen. Well, for a limited group of people.
A select
group.
Yes.
Yeah. Only the best. Only the best.
Mm-hmm.
It's gonna be so.
We have a rigorous screening process.
Oh yeah, very rigorous. You have to be able to come and have fun.
Yeah, that's the most important.
Yeah,
thing.
if you're
do
going
that,
to come and you're like, I don't know about this. It's just too nerdy, and there's too much fun having on, and I don't want to play silly games and win medals.
Win medals, yeah.
I'm very committed to having a medal ceremony.
Closing ceremonies.
Closing ceremonies. And there's a bunch of other stuff that's going to happen.
Yeah, we can't tell you.
Yeah.
Secret.
It's a secret. You know what isn't a secret, though, Nathan?
What's that?
How much I love Andy Root.
Yeah, you guys talked quite a bit about your mutual love of Charles Taylor.
I know. And last time he was on the podcast, he had a book that talked about Eberhard Jungel, and then we just talked about Jungel the whole time. And so I'm like, do you have some other thinker I like that you're into that will inspire a book where I can ignore half of it?
If you ever just want to have a
the other
conversation with Tripp, just write a book about a philosopher he likes.
Yeah, then it's just like, so you talk about this person for half the book. I'm just going to talk to you about them, okay? Look, I've been on podcasts before where they're like, Tripp, you like Whitehead, right? Yeah. Well, so what's he about? And then I never even, like, I was on a podcast once where I forgot to even mention that I went on there to tell them about my book. They were like, so what exactly is process theology? And then I started explaining it, and they're like, I like that. So how's this work? And
that was it.
Yeah, I know. I will listen, and I thought maybe they would help a brother out and put, by the way, he has a new book out in the intro.
Nothing.
No. They just shared.
You're just this conversation
Tripp's 5 first places to begin for process theology, and
you didn't even get any book sales.
I was like, what about the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Jesus? Because everyone needs more Jesus, unless you don't.
But you do, and you can get it from Amazon too.
And if you don't need more Jesus, you can buy the book and symbolically stow him. Anyway, so one thing before we start, like if you were thinking back to having spent a very intense month with Charles Taylor, what's something that popped in your head in that experience that you didn't anticipate being there, and is still around now?
Oh, the last section of the book was my favorite. But I feel like you only really can appreciate it after you get through the other 900 pages or whatever. I mean, I continually use some of his examples in the end of the book today. I mean, in just explaining different things, the way that he frames the way that we can experience the transcendent, you know, in a secular age today is just it's really powerful and helpful, I think. And
how many other times have you ever used the word supernova so frequently?
Oh my gosh! I mean, probably astronomy class was in undergrad was the last time.
I know,
and that was really only like once.
It was like, oh, we have a lesson that today we're talking about supernova.
Yeah, that was it.
And Charles Taylor's like, no.
Yeah, but I mean, I have an entire paper I wrote for a class on Matthew because he mentions in one paragraph that the Greek word for pity or compassion has to do with your guts. And that was like, that little paragraph there just sparked like this 25-page paper.
There you go.
So, it's good.
Well.
So read Charles Taylor. Or just email me and I'll send you my summary.
And then after you read that, you can read.
You gotta read Andy Root's book.
Mm-hmm.
But listen to this podcast first.
Oh, yeah. And share it with people.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Ooh.
And if you leave a review.
Yeah, if you go and leave a 5-star review with a question, like the review is you asking a question.
Yeah. You don't have to say anything.
Don't say anything. Just leave 5-star review, and then your actual review. Just ask a question. We'll answer it.
Yeah.
Whatever the question is.
I'm trying to decide if there's a question we wouldn't answer. I'm not saying you should test us, but I think most of them.
As long as you leave 5 stars and ask a question.
Yeah.
We'll answer it. So do that.
It's a quest view. Or re-question. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and I am here with Andy Root, who has like a really cool title for his chair because he's the Carrie Olson Baalson Chair of Youth and Family Ministry at Luther Seminary. Is how you pronounce it?
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Well, I don't want the people that endow your chair to hear it pronounced wrong.
Oh, they're always out on the lookout, and if they find out people are mispronouncing it, they go crazy. So,
the book stipend goes down.
Oh, it goes way down. Yeah.
Well, he's back on the podcast talking about his new book, Faith Formation in a Secular Age, responding to the church's obsession with youthfulness. This is the first of 3 books engaging Charles Taylor. And I love Charles Taylor enough that I assigned it and spent a whole semester going through it, the secular age, with a bunch of students. So, I'm interested in what before we jump in, you got to tell us what we're doing in May, or I'll forget. We'll get to the end of the podcast, Andy, and then we won't even have mentioned the fact that we're going to be hanging out together in Minneapolis, and clearly everyone should come hang out with us.
They should. Yeah. I'm trying to even think. It's got we're doing an event, and the event is connected to Templeton grant, a Sir John Templeton grant, as you're supposed to say when you publicly talk about these things. Templeton grant, it's the larger project called Science for Youth Ministry, and we're having our capstone concluding events in Minneapolis in early May. It's called something like When Jesus Wrote Dinosaurs and Other Silly Fables or Tales or something like that. And so, Tripp's going to be there. Krista Tippett's going to be speaking there. A handful of other cool people. So, if you're
Science Mike's going to be there if you like
Science podcasts. Mike's going to be there. Yeah, there's going to be like a podcast battle royale or something between you and Science Mike.
I mean, I guess I don't know if it's actual competition because I don't know if this is true, but I'm going to make it up.
Okay.
What I'm bringing to a podcast battle is actual scientific proof that Jesus did indeed ride a dinosaur. And I'm going to ride a dinosaur during the live podcast. That's what I'm going to do. So Science Mike, he is going to have to come up with something to please the people more than me riding a dinosaur while demonstrating scientifically that Jesus did too.
You didn't tell me you were going to Jurassic Park for spring break to get a dinosaur.
Oh, no, I can't tell you the sources for said things.
Okay.
No, I can't. I can't.
Well, people should come just for that to see you ride a dinosaur. That'd be pretty sweet.
Mm-hmm. And if it was like a few weeks from now and we announce a lot of other things that are happening, there may be a Homebrewed Christianity soiree happening either before or after it.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's a lot of incentive for people to come, so they should show up.
So, now, when did you fall in love with Charles Taylor? Because no one writes 3 books where Charles Taylor fans are going to go read the first half. So the first half of this book, you're explaining something Charles Taylor in a giant book. Was like, and I could probably need to do this, but, something about 1,200 pages just doesn't seem necessary. And then you go and take a giving an account of his work, expanding it into a new way of understanding God's presence and ministry and divine action. Like, where was this book born? Was it born engaging Taylor, or was it born like hearing normal youth minister talk and going, I think we need to think through this again?
Yeah, probably both equally, actually. I mean, we've already talked about the Templeton grant and the event that everyone must come to. But I had reviewed A Secular Age for, I think, Word and World Journal in like 2009. And so, not right when it was hot off the presses, but pretty quickly. I mean, it's taken like a decade for people to really kind of catch on to this book, and it's I think, profound impact. So I had reviewed it, and, I swam deep within it, but, was more confused and felt like I had a handle on it, but was enough to review it. And then, it was important to me, but kind of lost touch with it. And then when we did really early research for some of the stuff we were doing around youth ministry and science, it became really clear that that Taylor stuff was a really important lens to interpret what young people were going through and what was going on with them. So that led me back. And when I read it and went through it the second time is when I became a major fanboy. And, now I think really to get a handle on the thing, we're talking about if you, like you said, 1,200 pages, if you do all endnotes and things, I think I've gotten through it like 4 or 5 times, and I think it takes like 3.5 before you start really realizing the depth of the genius with it. So it was that kind of falling in love with Taylor, as well as just I felt weird about the conversations we were having across the church, but particularly in youth ministry, about faith formation. And it just, there was this incredible, and there still is this incredible desire to throw an adjective in front of faith. Like we're talking about consequential faith or real faith or super cool faith, or, some kind of adjective that would, I don't know, communicate that we were going somewhere deeper with it or something. And that always just theologically sat wrong with me. So it was using Taylor to get into why we feel this need to throw adjectives in front of faith, and maybe what makes faith formation so perplexing for us.
Well, in part of it, I think, and you bring this up in the part 1 of the book, is how Taylor describes our current situation as the age of authenticity. Now, philosophy majors probably hear authenticity and think Heidegger, but surprisingly, that's not actually how youth use being authentic. They haven't sat around with being in time. There's no structure of care and Dasein and such. Can you kind of give the explaining the age of authenticity pitch to a youth minister? So when you're sitting down with them and you're like, now, if you don't want to read this book 4 times in order for it to make sense, you at least got to get this.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's what I've had to actually do in these books, where, you just pick up 1 or 2 elements from Taylor because it's so rich. And in this book, I do pick up on his articulation of the age of authenticity, which is embedded in his ethic of authenticity. He wrote a much smaller book called The Ethic of Authenticity, and in Canada, it's actually published as The Malaise of Modernity, the same book. And what he really thinks the ethic of authenticity, which leads into the age of authenticity, is that every human being has a right to define for themselves what it means to be human, and that no external authority should determine what it means to be human, and that every human being has a right to do that. And within the age of authenticity, that is kind of mobilized with that ethic, that every human being has a right to define for themselves what it means to be human. So, I think people who are working with youth, like every youth lives with this kind of, it's in a background noise that they kind of take in, that they live, trying to live an authentic life means that you get to decide for yourself what it means for you to be you. And you only have to watch like episodes of Master of None or whatever on Netflix to see this kind of pop up everywhere, that and it actually becomes immoral to try to define for someone else what it means for them to be human. But then the second element of that, which I think really plays into the church and passing on faith, is that then you really should only give any kind of authoritative credence over to that which speaks to you. So if it moves you, if it connects you, if it's real to you, I mean, you can almost hear all the kind of hip hop slang that comes out of that. That comes out of the age of authenticity, that what's true, what's worth attending to is what somehow moves you. So Taylor's, in this really beautiful way that makes Taylor perplexing but also wonderful, he's very ironic with it. So he doesn't want to, I think what does he say? He doesn't want to be a knocker or a booster. So this age of authenticity, he's not opposed to it, but he's also thinks that we lose something in it. There's something problematic about it, but there's also something really quite beautiful about it.
Well, one of the things I think he does as, I don't know what you would call an edgy Canadian Catholic, is he goes, that modernity is the situation we're in. So if you want to have feels about it changing and this kind of movement towards an exclusive humanism, which sets up this understanding of individualism. Like, if you want to lose sleep about it and tell everyone, oh, let's just, go back to virtue ethics in the Catholic Church and whatnot, zippity doodah, but you aren't changing. So that also means what's gained in this new area, like what's being gained, and how do you talk about truth, encounter, and such. And one of the things I was struck by when he did it is just how simple or straightforward. He said that modern individualism takes 2 forms that, when problematic, create problems. Like, one is it gets debased, and then it leads to relativism, because the moment you're the one that authenticates whether or not something, quote, speaks to you or is true or resonates, that's fine. But then if it can lead to relativism, and it can be trivialized,
and that you can be real dismissive, but that leads to atomism. And one of the things I found reading it now, I'm sure most youth ministers didn't do this, but I would like ask, like, what are the ways, how do we treat this so it doesn't lead to relativism? But I wouldn't be saying like this has to be final. And how do we gather as a group and speak, sing, encounter, and share life together that doesn't leave us apart when we're apart?
Right.
And so I don't know. That was not really a question, but individualism for him, I think, is resisting both the glorification of it urge, but also the very common Christian super dismissive play.
Yeah. I think that's exactly what he means by being neither a booster nor a knocker, that he wants to find the way between there. And I mean, then you go to his most latest book about the language animals, and there's a sense for him where language actually constitutes this sense of relationship that's deeper and moves into that. But he doesn't. Yeah, I mean, he thinks that there are some real values in the age of authenticity. Now, I think, maybe one of the negatives of the first part of the book, and maybe I shouldn't even admit this because I should just tell people to buy 6 copies, for Christmas. But I mean, I'm trying to take more of, he has this lecture he gave at some Catholic group where he talks that there is real superficialities that come through the age of authenticity. And I'm trying to kind of follow that line. And so I think that there's some real advantages of being in the age of authenticity. But what I'm trying to kind of articulate, and this is maybe another place where the book is inspired, is that, Bonhoeffer, sometime in the mid 1930s, we're not even sure when, had these theses on youth work. And the first one was, since the days of the youth movement, talking about the German youth movement, that the church has been more enamored with the youthful spirit than the Holy Spirit. And so that's really what I was kind of sensing is a little bit of our issue within Protestantism in America overall, is that we really want young people. And I'm not sure we really want young people, but we want the youthful spirit in our institutions to keep them vital or significant in some way. So I was trying to put those together, and through Taylor kind of follow how some negative elements of the age of authenticity lead to a glorification of youthfulness, and how youthfulness then leads us in many ways to close spins, which is what Taylor wants to get away from, that it leads us away from being actually open to what we want most, I think, when we talk about faith formation, which is young people to encounter the living presence of God, encounter a living Jesus Christ. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to point to, is that in many ways, and this is very Taylor-esque, I guess, some of our best intentions have lead us into some kind of pretty narrow paths and dark alleys.
Well, what that kind of spawned to mind is the way he discusses how the age of authenticity leads to an ethics of recognition, where if you aren't fully recognized, that is the locus of genuine harm. And we can think about the fights about inclusion, gender inclusion, sexual identity inclusion, racial inclusion, religious inclusion in a more pluralistic context and stuff like that. But the underlying assumption he highlights is that human beings can only become what they have if they are recognized by the other. And to be less than recognized actually is a violent act of reduction to the other. When you were talking about that kind of obsession with youthfulness, I think the church's big insecurity is they really want the youth to recognize the church. It's not like yes, they have this desire for youthfulness, but it's kind of like the grandparent who will do all sorts of things they wouldn't do as a parent just for the grandkid to be like, man, grandpa, you're awesome. And that the church is wanting a cultural recognition that they're seeing themselves having lost post-Christendom by the youth turning away from the tradition. But they're wanting that recognition from the youth. And it leads to this kind of, like desire for youthfulness, thinking, oh, well, that's what I get them back. It leads to churches have contemporary services at 8:30 a.m. And you're like, you're like, what? No young family with kids wants to be up early enough to be there. And if you don't have kids yet, you are out too late to be anywhere at 8:30 in the morning.
Well, you might be coming back from the club at 8:30. It would be convenient to just kind of slide in and still a little hungover to come to church. Yeah. No, yeah. I mean, I think it actually becomes like almost like an echo chamber of recognition. So the church kind of feels like it's not being recognized, but wants young people to recognize them. But then young people, at least some of them, look back at the church and think, well, the problem with the church doesn't recognize these other forms. And then you enter into this kind of conflict over recognition. So, yeah, I mean, Taylor calls it the politics of recognition. And I don't know. I mean, I there's another project there that I probably won't do, but just how a social media world just hyperly turns the temperature up on the politics of recognition, and just how that impacts pastors is amazing. And how almost what you put on Twitter or Instagram or whatever becomes reality. And you have to do your work of recognition there, or you can even be called an evil person if you don't, don't recognize, and make recognition there. It's interesting.
And you get, like the I don't know what you'd call it, but, who was it? One of my friends that was talking about, he manages a bunch of church and denominational web pages. And he said one of the biggest shifts he's seen is the clickouts are becoming more and more the pastor or minister or leader social media accounts. Like before they ever listen to Andy's sermon, when I'm looking at superawesomlutheranchurch.com, they don't go to Andy's sermon. They go to his Instagram feed and they're like, oh, he's at a baseball game with his kids. Hey, he's drinking a beer, so he's not probably too pretentious, but that was 3 Brooks Brothers ties. I don't trust a man with 3 different Brooks Brothers ties. Like the clickouts are for private social media accounts, not the church ones, and for the employees. That's so much a recognition thing. And
it's so much.
Like I mean, I just remember in LA, I worked at a UCC church that was for 8 years. It was rather large, so I don't we had 2 services and there's around 800 people, so you don't know everyone. And in LA, half the church every 3 years is different because people come in and out. And, the number of times new people would come up and know my favorite teams. Oh, well, you're from the South, or we know you like tweeting during Laker games, very verbosely. Or like a family comes and the one partner tells to the other one and says, oh, well, if you don't have to come all the time, but Tripp would totally meet you just to have a beer or something. Cause they will see something on social media that it's, I would always joke. I'm like, I'm at the Beerable study, the thing for the people that go to our church that aren't that religious.
Yeah.
And so it was, so when he told me about the clickouts, I thought that's something.
It is something. That's crazy. Yeah.
Well, that was an aside, but so when
a good one though.
Yeah. So what is the challenge, or what's the question that you're wanting to ask around faith? You kind of highlight early on in the book that you were in conversations where like, oh, well, let's discuss the spiritual but not religious, or the nuns, or moral therapeutic deism, and all this type of thing. But the unquestioned question is what faith is, and you kind of talk about how there's a very reduced account of faith latent in the church. It's a natural factor, a social factor, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I mean, I think one of the other things that I really mobilized from Taylor here, and maybe have jiggled it to work with my thesis a little bit here, but the way he talks about the secularities, it sounds very kind of cool, and I don't know, Silicon Valley-ish or rock and roll-ish to be like secular 1, secular 2, secular 3. But my overall take really is, secular 2 is this sense of the secularization theory, or that people are participating in religious communities less. And, Taylor's point is, that's happening, and particularly, Western European countries, that's happening. But that's not the real issue that we face. The real issue we face is secular 3, which is that the conditions of belief have changed. And what I tend to see when we have these conversations about the nuns, or the spiritual but not religious, or moral therapeutic deism, which has been a big conversation, is it almost always gets trapped in a secular 2 conversation. Mm-hmm. And then when it gets caught in a secular 2 conversation, then the way we even define faith, I love sociologists. Some of my best friends are sociologists, but we concede what faith is over to sociology and over to the social sciences in that way. And the sociologists need to mold faith to an instrument that they can actually measure, which they tend to then mold it towards kind of consent to variables on a survey or to participation or something like that. And I'm just trying to push that if we really ultimately are about young people having faith, it can't just be reduced to participation and consented belief on a survey. And so that we have, and I think this has happened in a lot of the more pragmatic youth ministry, but not just youth ministry. I mean, I think this book moves beyond just youth ministry, just a way we tended to talk about faith within, well, with just, I think, clergy and religious professionals is we've tended to unknowingly concede to a secular two kind of perspective, that it has to do with just participation, which is important. I'm not trying to downplay that, but if we lose the ability to talk about actually divine action as a real thing, then we're stuck already and we're lost.
No,
and that's kind of where I'm pushing.
So I want to come right back to the divine action thing, because all team process is in full agreement that when a real God doing real things in a real world becomes a problematic thing for the church to talk about, that it's losing its biscuits, even if it's fully faithful to the language game of Christendom. Just so if people have not read Taylor completely, the secular for him is not just what's the remainder after we subtract our beliefs or myths or superstitions, because scientists or historians tell us to. That he calls like the process of abstraction. Yeah. But secularization doesn't happen for Taylor by removing religion and what's left after, quote, being saved from it. The secular is a child of religion for Taylor, and it carries the marks of its parents, who were actually the reformers, with this like individual, here I stand, I can do no other, I believe, I like, give me the Bible and reason, and now the Bible we just reasoned away, so now give me reason in me. So a secular society, he argues, is achieved not by the religious dying, but it's reborn under a completely different conditions and takes new forms, where unbelief isn't required, but the contestability of belief is assumed.
Right.
And I think that the thing that you can usually spot in ministers, and it's across the generations, is when someone sees when a minister or a person of faith denies the possibility of a meaningful life for those without reference to the transcendent or eternity or God, then they're stuck on that secular two notion, where the secular is by definition the opponent to the sacred, and it's a battle, and they are, and those humans are in some depraved, lacking situation. And you're wanting to talk about faith not in that fight. Is that
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think maybe we read Taylor a little differently here, but I mean, I think I do want to say, and I think Taylor echoes this in some of his other work, that there is something in the human spirit that wants to open up to something bigger, but that people have found all sorts of reasonable ways to live without God, and they're not really walking around going, what am I missing? And I think we get caught. I think I'm echoing exactly what you're saying, that we get really caught in ministry if we just think like, well, we just have to wait for people, or we just have to be near people enough that they'll say, I'm missing something, give me the answer to the question, the question I didn't even know I had, or something, or the question that I have, when really they don't even have a lot of these questions. And I just think it is really fascinating that you only get a really pietistic kind of Reformation theology, or post-Reformation, real pietists who really want to be close to God, that can create the conditions for a society where you don't need God. I mean, that's just what's so fascinating about Taylor, that I don't think we've really dealt with enough, that it's these conditions of really trying to be near God that allow, particularly in the 19th century, for us to start to create conditions for us not to need God at all, which I think is fascinating.
Well, and part of it, I think, is like when he describes the cross pressuring and our contemporary context is like that you are this buffered self as opposed to porous, where the sacred and stuff just oozes around. That like you're stuck between disenchantment and in disenchanted world and enchanted one, and you like exist in this immanent plane, but there are hints of transcendence just nestled in human language and all this type of thing. And this pressure that is pushing in on a self as opposed to a culture or a tradition or whatever the buffered self ends up kind of seeing the individual outside of nature and out and away from an enchanted world. And it reshapes the way we ask, like, what is faith, or what do we mean by faith?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that becomes our big issue. And I've just kind of got done I'm done composing volume 2 of this, which I think will be called The Pastor in a Secular Age, which looks more at the buffered self and enchantment, and how I think it becomes a real conundrum for people who are just a pastor in general to think about what's going on with the Eucharist and communion when you just presume, and you don't even mean to, but you just kind of presume a disenchanted realm. But I think this just makes divine action, talking about the encounter with God, much more difficult when it's just in the air. It's just the background to presume imminence, and to actually have to be kind of taken into open takes. And so to me, that's the real problem we face in forming faith, is just to find ways to open up spaces for people to articulate encounter with divine presence. And if we can't do that, then we're in big trouble. And I think a lot of the more practical and pragmatic takes on faith formation tend to concede to institution building and making institutions more apt at kind of capturing people's participation than actually leaning into the perplexities and beauties of trying to give visions of how to encounter transcendence or divine action.
Mm-hmm. So how do you describe or understand the burden, or how would you describe the anxiety of the secular age? If you think of like the way Tillich kind of saw anxieties emerging in different cultures, but the way he describes this nova effect, where the autonomous self becomes the heart of the religious spiritual center, and that elevation of the self, where you are kind of the one tasked with the burden of coming to know the truth, living in it, and all that kind of thing. Like all of a sudden, every human being is bearing the burden of Martin Luther in a sense, right. Without extreme confidence that when Christ says your sins are forgiven, you can trust it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the way I read Taylor, particularly that, I don't know what part 3 or part 4, is that the burden that we face, the anxiety we face, is a little bit like Tillich. It's anxiety, but the anxiety is this dull feeling of malaise.
Yeah.
That maybe our relationships don't matter. Maybe our rituals have no kind of solemnized importance. Maybe the passages of our lives don't really mean anything. So I think that the burden that we all bear is that if you're a believer, that you are always thrust in and out of the cross pressure of unbelief. But I think it also works the other way, which I find really generative and important with Taylor, that if you are a non-believer, if you are a doubter, sometimes you have to believe. Sometimes you're cross pressured to realize that life is more than just natural material, that there's more to existence. So I think the anxiety goes both ways, of kind of being cross pressured and never being able to kind of solidly stand anywhere and say, I know this is true, or we have to redefine what that actually might mean. And I think it often is more based in kind of relational dynamics or moments of kind of shared personhood that says, I know this is true because this person has been there for me, or I had an experience of God when this person prayed for me or something, as opposed to just basing that in tradition or institution or something like that. I think those things all get kind of cross-pressured in many ways. And one of the things that I think, or at least one of the frameworks that Taylor highlights as this process of excarnation, is something that I think shows itself more in youth ministry, at least directly, than a lot of other parts of the church. Like where Protestantism kind of converts the gospel into this commodity. It excarnates it out of materiality and the relationality that exists in, and it functions as a solution for problems on a market. And then the tradition becomes the, selling these solutions on a market, and it takes it out of the rhythms, the practices, the relationships, and such. And, youth ministry in and of itself is something where, like, you have adults who become adult members by taking them out of the congregation. And then they stay in essentially parachurch organizations that cater to all their cultural norms,
and all this type of stuff. And that's where they exist for a long time. And then people go like, I can't believe, they don't want to come be a member of our congregation when the church revolves around them more than their parents do. So often. So like, how do you understand that, the way we've even treated youth ministry so much in the church affecting, making the question of what faith looks like even more problematic?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've totally added to that. And so one of the roads I'm trying to follow in this book is, and maybe add a little bit to Taylor, my own take on Taylor, is to try to follow this youthfulness monster that's come out of the age of authenticity. And so then to look at kind of following Bonhoeffer, he says, since the days of the youth movement. So I try to do like this historical analysis. So it's not only like Taylor's ideas that are inspiring this book, but also in many ways his method. I'm like trying to do my own philosophical genealogy. Like, I don't know if Taylor does it as well as Nietzsche, and I know I don't do it as well as Taylor, but I'm trying. And so I try to sketch out what the days of the youth movement, what, late 60s has meant for this culture, in which I really believe is the birthplace of contemporary youth ministry, a particularly congregational based youth ministry. And I think it all has to do with the fact that the youth became a scary entity. And we always talk about a generation gap, but I don't know that when we talk about a generation gap, like if I talk about a generation gap with my son who's 13, I'm really not talking about a generation gap. I'm talking about certain conflicts we have over media consumption, over certain perspectives, but we both pretty much concede to the age of authenticity.
Right.
That every human being has a right to define for themselves what it means to be human. The real generation gap, which was probably just an ultimate son of a bitch for a lot of people, was when this transition happens in the late 60s, where you have a whole younger generation who thinks that they have a right to define for themselves what it means to be human. If I don't want to go to Vietnam, I don't have to go to Vietnam. And we're going to burn our bras while we burn our draft cards. I mean, we're going to throw off all these kind of strictures of the culture. And their parents, who really see the point as duty and obligation to these larger systems. Yeah. I mean, that's a real generation gap. And I think youth ministry becomes born in that time, where we look at our young people and actually think that they're crazy and that they're nuts, and that you actually then have to get a loyal, youthful person to go reach the youthful ones. And I try to trace this back to Southern California, where you just came from.
Oh, yeah.
Like that SoCal becomes the place, not of youth ministry. I mean, we had all these parachurch organizations that were created back east from Texas to the Midwest, but congregational based youth pastor in a church, I think really has its roots in California. And it's really a response of conservative Protestants to the kind of post Summer of Love, late 60s, early 70s youth culture, and the ability to kind of have some kind of resonance with those group of people and then take them in. But I think it's led exactly to what you're saying, is a further disconnect. So the youth group becomes the place where you take in the alien beings and try to convert them to the larger kind of secular too kind of perspectives. And it becomes a way to build the church. And these Southern California churches build their churches pretty quickly by getting these countercultural kids to start coming inside the church doors. And not all that is bad, but I think it's led to, I draw from David Brooks' older book, Bobos in Paradise, and think that youth ministry, particularly suburban youth ministry, is a perfect creation for Bobos, for both people who have found a way to bring together the bourgeois and this kind of romantic kind of perspective, and bring these together, the bohemian and the bourgeois together. And I think youth ministry becomes about that. It becomes about protecting kids so that they can get into good colleges, but at the same time letting them find themselves and go on mission trips and discover really who they are. Mm-hmm. And it becomes a perfect place, I think, for Boboism. And I'm just not so sure that actually is what we're about when we talk about the gospel. But I think that's exactly what's occurred.
Well, and I think one of the challenges the church has is, I'm going to guess, those that were able to push boundaries while still getting into good schools are all your best students at seminary.
Yeah.
If you ask the students that are there, and you're like, hey, who in here has a very committed personal piety and looking forward to serving the church? And you're like, now keep your hands up if youth group was like the coolest thing you did in high school, you had powerful experience serving the poor, and when you were edgy, you did it with your friends from youth group. And very few hands are coming down.
Right.
So like, what is it like, thinking of the very leaders in the church asking these questions are ones who are in leadership because of because these very mechanisms kind of created the context for their coming to be leaders.
Yeah. I mean, I think it becomes a huge challenge, I think, and I mean, I'm not sure. Yeah. I mean, to me, when we have to kind of move into kind of thinking about what we actually mean by faith and what are we actually talking about. And I think in a lot of youth ministries, the trophies that we have of like, well, it's really hard in ministry is really hard, but at least we have these kids who have really been committed. I don't know. Usually those kids tend to be it's a more S2 kind of thing, secular too, than these are actually people who are really wrestling with the depth of divine action and entering into those realities.
So describe for us the kind of the concept of divine action and how that recarnates the excarnated concept of faith.
Yeah. So, I guess the second half of the book, I really try to set up the real problematic with these seculars and then try to think, well, how would we really respond to this? And, so, I mean, divine action for me is just kind of thinking about revelation and encounter with the living Jesus Christ. People in faith and science stuff have talked about divine action. One of my people I read early on in my Princeton days, Jim Loder, would always talk about divine action. So in some ways, divine action is a stand-in for me for what Taylor would mean by transcendence, except transcendence. I mean, maybe divine action is confusing too, but transcendence, it seems to people, when you talk about, well, his problem's excarnation, but he wants to talk about transcendence, always get a little confused.
Well, I liked how you put it, right as you're going into part 2, that, if you want to reimagine faith formation, why don't we tackle the deism first before the moral and the therapeutic part?
Right. And so that's kind of what I'm hoping the second half of the contribution is like, how do we, I find it really fascinating, to be a little snarky and maybe a little mean, is that a lot of the stuff that's talking about how we pass on faith or do faith formation in this 21st century or whatever, almost never define what faith is. It's just a presumed category. And if it does, faith does have something which Paul means, where you encounter the living Jesus Christ who takes what's dead and makes it alive. And that Paul can even say, I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. Those are some pretty crazy statements that we need to talk about and actually articulate what does that mean actually to be taken into Christ and be ontologically changed into Christ and Christ into you. I mean, those are some big statements. So I'm trying to open up that we better be willing to talk about those. And if we're not, then maybe it just shows that we're really about religious socialization more than we're actually about encounter with the living God. And I just don't, my read of Paul is I don't think that's what Paul's after. And I'm really trying to pick up what Paul then says faith actually is here, then I kind of take this turn more to biblical studies and draw probably almost too much from Michael Gorman's work, who I found really fascinating here, which is that faith really is this experience of, it's really a death experience where you find Jesus coming into the midst of your death experience and taking what's dead in you and making it alive, which is a really different way to form faith. Faith is, opposed to having a great time at church and being really committed to it, where maybe what faith is actually articulating and testifying to your death experience and having a community that you can articulate that to, and then finding the living Jesus Christ in and through sharing that death experience and finding a minister who's there to actually be with you as you articulate that. So for me, I'm trying to think of divine action more as this state of ministry, that God actually is a minister and that faith is really receiving and then giving this kind of ministry, and that it does some pretty profound ontological things, that it takes us actually into, through this fellowship of action, it takes us actually into the being of God. And so there's this kind of sense of theosis. So I'm trying to cutely maybe obscurely contrast moral therapeutic deism with kenosis, hypostasis, and theosis. Though I don't think I'm going to find that in any t-shirts anytime soon. But
I don't know.
So I'm trying to link those together. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, like, if you put it as a required text for your classes, you're like,
maybe that.
Go to teespring.com and buy Andy's shirt.
Everyone in class must have a T-shirt that says kenosis, hypostasis, and theosis.
Yeah. So, say a bit about how in our context you understand that negation of the negation through the cross.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty, throughout all my work. Maybe this is just I read Bonhoeffer, and Bonhoeffer opened my eyes to so many things, but I just still am really captivated by this kind of moment of shared personhood, or what I like kind of broaden out here to the Cappadocians through Zazoulis, is this sense of hypostatic encounter. That there's ways when we share in each other's personhood. This is Bonhoeffer in Sanctorum and Communo saying Jesus Christ exists as church community, that Jesus Christ exists as within the person structure of the community. So I'm just trying to wonder in this text, if we think of transcendence, if we think of divine action as coming through this hypostatic encounter, does that give us a way to actually talk about divine action? Does it give us a way to actually invite people to story and to tell the stories of their experience of feeling ministered to and ministering to another through this kind of hypostatic experience? And I mean, I tend to think, and maybe there needs to be more research done here, but that when people really talk about transformation in our cultural context, which I think Taylor opens a space that people do, and that we need to get back to this, and this is part of one of the reductive elements of the immanent frame, is that we tend to think we don't need any talk about sin anymore, and we don't really need transformation anymore, and we've eclipsed grace. But I think when people talk about experiences of transformation in and outside the church, it usually is through a hypostatic encounter. It's usually through another person who was there for you. Someone says, I don't know what happened, but it was a holy moment. I was getting on a plane. I was going to have to fly home to bury my dad. And this stranger just sat next to me and, just put their hand on my shoulder and was there for me. And I just really felt like the presence of God was there. And that moment, it changed my life in an incredible way. I mean, sometimes those are benign or even in deeper moments than that. And so I think I'm trying to follow that path, to think of this kenotic moment of humbling ourselves that opens us up to a hypostatic experience of shared personhood, leads to a depth of transformation, and turns you into a minister for your neighbor, which is, I guess, to echo Luther a little bit, that we come little Christs to one another, that we actually manifest the very presence of God in taking on the action of God, which is to minister to one another in and through our death experiences.
Mm-hmm. So the negation then of you, like divine action comes by encountering, or these events of encounters, and where your life before the event is set against the encounter, and be it like Paul's Damascus Road experience or something like that, and those moments, your own being and the being of the other who's addressing you, your own being comes to participate in divine being, like the very material actions that we close off from the possibility of the presence of the transcendence. It's in those very bodies that God becomes present.
Yeah, for sure. And that becomes the negation of the negation, is that when another enters into my experiences of negation, my multiple experiences of death, and shares in them, that it negates the negation and leads to some profound transformation, I think. And so I try to sketch this with the Acts 9 story, that what's profound about Paul is that he encounters a person where Paul actually experiences a minister there for him, and that experience of Ananias entering into Paul's death experience, which in many ways Ananias has to be willing to enter into death. He even has to wonder, is this a trap? But then goes and experiences Paul's own death experience, that all he had envisioned is not true. And it's one of the reasons I like Gorman so much, is because Gorman sets up that, Paul has this whole, back to Taylor, kind of moral horizon as he goes to Damascus, and it's to be like Phineas and purify the boundary and be a zealot. And then when he's knocked to the ground, he realizes that faith is something much more like Abraham, where you have to trust that out of a dead womb and out of a death experience, that faith is really trusting that the living God comes out of negation, and that negates the negation and brings to huge, I think, to really profound and beautiful points of transformation. So you just tend not to see that when we talk about faith, is actually what it means to lead people into faith is not to somehow convert them to some kind of secular two mindset, but is to open up a space for them to confess and then to be cared for, and to confess their death experience and then have other people come alongside and minister to them. So faith, the first step of faith then isn't you kind of meeting some kind of bar, but actually the moment of being able to kind of confess your places of brokenness and death and be open to another caring for you.
So you have a chapter that's titled From Membership to Mystical Union. And, I imagine that, most ministers reading this, they could resonate with lots of what's going on. But, this chapter kind of would, get under the professional's fingernails most, problematically. Now I notice you don't talk a whole lot about, tithing in the chapter, but I do think it's important because so much of our enlightenment friendliness when it goes to what it means to belong to a faith community or connected with membership, giving, attending, and these type of things. And when you start to see the transcendent or the presence of God as coming through these material actions and encounters that become ministerial, presence dripping enriched events, and you talk about this kind of these theotic encounters, then all of a sudden membership just seems real boring. But also you go, I don't think I want to get up at church and be like, we're moving from membership to mystical union, because then all of a sudden you'll realize just how many members in your congregation are uninterested. You're like, whoa, I'm uncomfortable with that. Let's sing a hymn.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, it is a problem, right? Like, I do have some sympathy for people who want to hold on to this kind of secular too and make sure our institutions are strong. I mean, I'm at a seminary and we're having all sorts of questions about, what's the next 10 years going to be and how are we going to find a sustaining vision for that? And how is it going to be funded, for God's sakes? Like those are huge questions. And I think any church professional really has to wrestle with those. However, I just don't think there is really any future if that is what we flatten things out to. And my guess, and I could be completely naive here, but my guess, and I guess it's an educated guess, but my guess is that there's a lot of people out there who are in our churches who have had some kind of mystical experience before. In my book, Crystal Praxis, I just did a little bit of research, life history interviewing, and just interviewed people at two Presbyterian churches and a Lutheran church, and asked them if they've had experience of God, and an eventful experience. And they all said they had. Now it probably was partly the way I asked the question, but I think there's more people out there, even in mainline churches, than are really rewarded for saying. And I think it's an interesting ecclesiology that even people who will come to church and who want to be members and still see a value in membership have had these experiences, but don't think these kind of experiences are what you talk about at church, and where you find your kind of even identity at church. And so I don't know, maybe I'm naive, but I want us to kind of lean into people. I want to get us back to testimony in some ways. And I draw from Mandy Drury's book, who I think she's done a great job of talking about kind of recovering the practice of testimony.
Well, one of the things I thought of, and is that mainline Protestants, in the way we understand what it means to be a member and participate in practice, once you got done initialing next to whatever catechism you needed to, it really seems to be the result of abstraction. Like, what is the dominant level of abstraction for the cultural elite in your congregation? And so, like, if you are in Southern California, you've abstracted, any real need to make an eschatological statement, definitely physical resurrection. You probably are just uncomfortable with divine action in general because we would hate for anyone that's a Christopher Hitchens fan to feel too uncomfortable if they found out what we did when we gathered at church. And so, like, that concept of abstraction, getting rid of all the parts of religion that aren't, just to be assumed in the West as the Enlightenment goes on. I think that's how we came to define ourselves, because that's how institutions define yourself, as something that will do what's already in your life better than you're doing it now, like fast food or whatever it is. Like, we want to help you out. We're not against you. We're just like you, but we can make this part better. And So what is it we do? Well, we'll help your kids get into college and not drink, smoke, or have sex before they do.
Right.
And
which is perfect for the Bobo, like I said. Perfect.
I know. Yeah. So to me, I think there's a one of the helpful parts of this, and also even thinking back to like, what do you do in a congregation, is abstraction makes us like boring.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Christians should be weird. Like when they're like, what do you do? And you use the language and the imagery and the hints of transcendence that run through our tradition are resources to pull out of the attic, not things to cover up and go, all right, during confirmation, I have to tell you about the Trinity. Okay.
Yeah, totally. And I just wonder if, part of what the church is, and at least my limited read on Paul's ecclesiology, is that these are you just gather and you say, this really weird shit happened to me. Like this Jesus showed up to me. I don't know if I can say S word and Jesus in the same sense, but this is,
you're allowed.
Yeah. All right. So, like this happened to me. I had this encounter. And then part of what's beautiful, I think, about it, and this maybe highlights a little of Taylor from Sources of the Self, is that you have to give an account of that too. Because this isn't just a excarnated mystical experience, but happens through bodies in time and space, that you have to give your best account of this experience. And then the part of the rest of the community is to say, I don't buy it. Or I think were you taking LSD when you thought this? Or had you slept in 48 hours? Like it's part of the discernment process is actually to be critically engaged in interpreting these experiences. But if you start right off the top saying, well, these kind of experiences are just, some form of psychological transference, if you give them over to the immanent frame, then all you can be is exactly what you said, is the church can only be a resource that adds to your life. It can only be it can only speak the kind of Bobo game of we can, better than anyone else, we can make sure your kids wear their seatbelt.
Oh yeah,
which I have a kid who's on the horizon of driving in, 2 or 3 years. Wearing your seatbelt's important, but man, there's got to be more to church than that.
Yeah. Did you know that Jesus is like the safety belt for the soul?
That's right.
Yeah. That's in chapter 11 of this book. I don't know if that got you all excited. You can go buy it right now. Chapter 11, Safety Belt Jesus. Actually, it's not in here, but one of my favorite lines.
Probably sell more copies if it was, though.
Okay, it is in here. I think it's towards the end of the book. You said, the deism in moral therapeutic deism asserts that God is our pet and has no distinct ontological force to transform us. This God is a nice idea that endorses my life as it is and keeps me happy, the T, and from being a jerk, the M. Now, I laughed and said yes, but assuming someone hasn't spent much time thinking about it and are sitting here going like, I don't know, I guess my church is different. It doesn't do that. What are kind of the common places if you start looking around for the MTD sneaking in your congregation, or in your faith? Like, what are some of the MTD pieties?
Yeah, well, that's great. I mean, I think probably the MTD pieties, well, like you said earlier, I want to start from the back. And so once we are actually quite skeptical that God could actually act and move and call us into something, then we really turn the moral category and the therapeutic category into just feeling good and don't be a jerk. And so, I think we see it everywhere. I mean, it's almost hard to name because it just tends to be everywhere. And so, I think maybe an example is when we think of mission trips, really not as really encounters of ministering with others and encountering the presence of God and ministering to others, but a way that faith, you'll hear this from youth workers sometimes, like mission trips are so important because it's like faith on steroids for kids. In other words, a mission trip becomes a way to get them more committed to certain institutionalized forms of faith. I think once we become really uncomfortable in the main line with any kind of sense of judgment in many ways, that if following God makes you feel bad in that it can't be right. Now, I'm not trying to say it's spiritually abusive in any way, but for there to be transformation, there has to be a sense that something isn't right, and that there's a deeper vision here. And so when we kind of concede that, then I think it becomes a problem when church is just supposed to make me feel good. And anything that makes me uncomfortable then just can't be anything I can listen to. Then I think we've entered into that realm.
Okay. I like the Finnish interpretation of Luther, and you do too.
Yeah. I do.
We're nearing, and it probably comes out after the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. So why should the German become Finnish?
Why should the German better hockey? The Finns play way better hockey than the Germans. No, I mean, I'm kind of convinced by it. I mean, I'm at a Lutheran seminary, and I think probably most of the historians at my school don't like the Finnish interpretation. Think it's probably not the real Luther. As a practical theologian with more of a kind of constructive theological edge, I don't care. I mean, I think that you can see this stuff in Luther, and I think it's really helpful. I think there is a way that Luther and the theology done in the shadow of I think there's a way that Luther's been co-opted by a certain kind of post-Kantian thought, where things get just completely molded into epistemology, and that's affected us in a huge way, and it's affected faith formation, where really we need strong churches. Why do we need strong churches? So young people know that Jesus loves them, so that they'll commit to knowing that the church has something in their life. So it always kind of comes back to these captivated by epistemology, and where the Finnish interpretation is helpful is it reminds us, man, there's some deep ontological commitments to the Christian faith, and in a secular age, as Taylor describes it, that becomes hard for us to talk about. But if we just give up ground, we're going to have, there's really no transformational engine anywhere else. We have to be able to talk about some level of kind of ontological transformation. I think the Finnish interpretation helps us kind of think about that and recover Luther in that way. So I like it a lot, actually.
Mm-hmm. And one of the other parts I think about that particular understanding is the way it emphasizes the dual function of Christ for the believer.
Yeah.
And
that you are actually given Christ. And I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to push as to say faith is to say that you are given Christ, that you are actually given and participate in the being of this one who is fully God and fully human. I mean, it's an ontological connection. And I think really, if we're quite honest, that makes no sense to us. Like, that really makes no sense to us of how you could be given Christ or that you could be in Christ. Like, that just is a really hard concept for us. And I guess part of the challenge of the book is to say, man, as people in ministry, we've really got to talk about how we can make that, I don't want to necessarily say coherent, but how that can connect at some level with people, because it's really important.
Mm-hmm. So when you finish this book and are looking to the second, which you just wrapping up working on for the pastor, like, what were the questions that came out of looking at the genealogy of American evangelical youth ministry with the framework that Taylor gave? What were your hunches going into thinking about being a pastor, and what were the in the process of it takeaways that you weren't quite expecting?
Yeah, so I tried, and we'll see how this works, man. You're always in fear and trembling after you finish a project if it will really, really work. But I think it did. I mean, it's a little bit more of an ambitious project because it's even more of a genealogy. And I try to trace how certain elements of Taylor's secular age, from disenchantment, from disenchantment to the buffered self, to the affirmation of ordinary life and what that means, and then into his age of authenticity, but back to the age of mobilization and the ancient regime, and then his Durkheims, his Paleo-Durkheimian, Neo-Durkheimian, and then post-Durkheimian. So I try to trace those through a genealogy with pastors that starts with Augustine, it goes to Thomas Becket, goes to Jonathan Edwards, goes to Harry Ward Beecher, then or to Henry Ward Beecher, then to Harry Fosdick, and then to Rick Warren, and tries to show how these pastors have both pushed forward and been impacted by the secular age as Taylor describes it. And so I was surprised to see how well that kind of plays out. Now maybe it's just how I wrote it, but how well that plays out. And so those are some of the directions I went. What I was surprised with theologically is that I had known a lot about Robert Jensen's work, God rest his soul, but Jensen became a really important dialogue partner for me to try to answer these questions and get even more deeply into God's own ontological state as minister. And so a lot more Old Testament and Jensen's theology and Old Testament stuff brought forth, which I didn't think I would do. I've never worked a lot in Old Testament texts, and so that was kind of exciting. So we'll see how it plays out, but more genealogy and then dialogue with Old Testament texts and Jensen's theology. So we'll see.
Awesome. Well, thank you for hanging out on the internet.
Yeah, always fun. And next time I want to hear you sing that song.
Oh, well, I'll do it in May. That's what I'll do.
Hey, there you go. So people should come just to hear you sing.
Well, because nothing says scientific reflection in youth ministry like Michael W. Smith karaoke.
Nothing. It's too bad that the lineup for the conference is already filled, or we could try to get Michael W. Smith there.
If we tweet fast and ferociously, we're like, oh, we need you to come do a duet with Tripp.
That would be sweet. That would be amazing, actually.
Yeah, you would get some different attendees than you probably are going to get right now.
That's probably true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But everyone, here's hoping.
Here's hoping.
Is there going to be a session on Jungle? Because I think that should happen. Youth ministers never read Jungle. It's already complicated and stuff, but maybe there should just be a week-long event called Charles Taylor and Jungle, and then
that's right.
if we get 3 other people to come, then like the first half of the week we discuss secular age, and then we do Jungle time.
That would be awesome. And on breaks we'll listen to Michael W. Smith.
Obviously, well, Michael's actually going to lead worship for the retreat.
That would be great. And then we can call that post-event Your Secret Ambition.
Well, your secret ambition is kenosis.
That's right.
Hypostasis and theosis.
Right. No, your secret ambition is to really understand what Jungle means when he says God's being is in becoming. That's your secret ambition that you don't know you have and you never thought you would have, but you do.
Yeah, well, that's an event. I feel like the number of states where you can be chemically centered enough to fully encounter it are small but growing. Yeah. So you do that one. You do that one in Oregon, Colorado, California. Right. Then you're like, right. God's being is in becoming. Obviously.